Students, hey, it's Dr. Gatling with Lecture 1, Introduction. This book, Leadership, I think is one of the best books that I could find on the market because it really gives both the instructor as well as the student, a very up-to-date look at leadership, both on the theory side as well as the practical side. So this is going to be a relatively quick lecture. I know how difficult it could be to sit through, an hour and a half of me sort of talking to slides here. But what I hope to share with you is some experience. Certainly the theory you will read in the textbook, and I highly encourage you to spend time reading the book before you take the quiz. That way you're much more informed and able to answer quiz questions more effectively. So let's just get to it here. So I want to talk a little bit about the importance of leadership, how leadership has been defined and conceptualized, different definitions, different components, and then we'll talk a little bit about leadership, the descriptive process of understanding leadership, whether we look at it from a trait versus process perspective, or whether we look at it from an assigned versus emergent perspective. Certainly, the relationship between leadership and power historically has been well researched. Leadership and coercion, which unfortunately I see far too much of in our world today. And then I want to close by differentiating leadership from management and just making sure that we're very clear about those higher order differences. So first, let's talk about the evolution of leadership. It's really interesting, and it goes even further back, as you might imagine, than not the 1900s. But what's really interesting to me is this notion of control and the centralization of power. Is really born sort of out of the management theory, which really came about from military theory. So a lot of what we understand today in terms of our definitions really have their roots, in management. There's a definition in the book from 1927 that was presented by Moore, and I'm just going to read the definition because I just think it's really interesting. The ability to impress the will of the leader on those led and induce obedience, respect, loyalty, and cooperation. It's amazing that definition was the one that was resonating back, in the 1920s, and how much our leaders today attempt to actually bring that definition to life. So there is this evolution that really transitioned to leadership as a trait in the 1930s, and we're going to talk a lot about traits. I have very strong opinions about trait theory. In the 1940s, we had the group approach, and I will tell you that, in my view, leadership is found at the individual, group, and organizational levels. Now, in this class, we're going to obviously talk a lot about the organizational level, but certainly there will be times where we will be talking about the group and the individual level. And then leadership as a behavior. In the 1960s, organizational behavior came on the scene in the 1970s, and we're still heavily invested in leadership as a behavior, organizational behavior, both in the academic world as well as the practical world. So this explosion of research occurred in the 1980s. Just out of nowhere, we saw just a proliferation of articles that focus on the leader's will. In leadership as influence. There's a book out today, or at least I think it came out, I don't know, at some point in the 2000s, called Influence. Influence is, I think, is a really important characteristic of leadership. But you influence people through, in my view, through inspiring them, through encouraging them, um, perhaps even persuading them to see things that they cannot see. Um, Again, the trait component of leadership or view of leadership exploded in the 80s. And I tell you, it's still a fascinating area to research. I've done some research here recently with trait theory. And then, of course, transformational leadership, or leadership as a transformational process. I think Burns back in 78 introduced, this notion of leadership as a transformation. So now here we are in the 21st century, looking at leadership. Certainly the author of the book looks at leadership as a process. And I would not disagree with him. Um, I personally am heavily invested in this notion of moral leadership. So moral leadership would be sort of a hierarchical umbrella for authentic leadership, spiritual leadership, and servant leadership. Now, I haven't done anything with adaptive leadership, but I have published articles on authentic leadership, on spiritual leadership, but more specifically, workplace spirituality. I actually posted a couple of the articles that I have written in the module under supplemental material. But we'll talk a little bit about these as we go through. But I'm certainly heavily vested in the 21st century view of leadership. So conceptualizing leadership, there are so many different ways, so many different perspectives, so many different views in terms of doing that. Whether we look at it as a group process, as a trait, being a personality perspective, or leadership as a behavior. There are so many different conceptualizations. I personally have belief that leadership is situational, and that it depends on the situation, it depends on the circumstance in terms of how, in the context, in terms of how I would define leadership. I'm heavily vested in this notion of leadership as a skill, and we'll talk about that in Module 3. But certainly you are going to, or I'm going to ask you to really search yourself and get your own conceptualization of leadership. Now, clearly, the book gives us a definition, and it's a very general definition. I would agree with the definition, but I would ask you to extend this. I would ask you to, when you write your paper, your personal philosophy paper, I want you to talk about what your conceptualization is, what your definition of leadership is, because after we've talked about it, in terms of certainly a trait and a skill, at least those two perspectives you will have a firm grasp on. But the book gives you another view. Leadership is a process. So however you develop your philosophy and your view is going to be up to you. At the end of the day, it's got to work for you. So I think it's really important to do that, and you'll get an opportunity to apply the theories that we're learning in the actual paper. So the components that are necessary or central to leadership and leaders, clearly a process, and we've talked about that. It involves influence. It occurs in a group context. Leadership attends to common goals. Without common goals, there's no need for leadership. So those elements are central elements. In terms of the leader, this whole notion that followers, and I'll tell you, I just submitted an article to the Journal of Business Ethics on followership. Actually, it was relational transparency, group transparency, and how it affected follower outcomes. But both leader and follower are involved today. Leaders and followers need each other. Leadership used to be a hierarchical, top-down, do it my way or the highway proposition. But today, it's changed. This is an important point here. Leaders often initiate and maintain the relationship. It is the leader's responsibility, in my view, to maintain positive working relationships with his or her people. It is not up to the follower to initiate that. In my view, it's the leader's responsibility to maintain those positive relationships. This notion that leaders are not above or better than followers, I think is true and it's valid. I tell people all the time when I worked in the industry that we're all on the same team working towards the same goals. I just have a different role. That concludes the lecture for chapter 1, and I look forward to seeing your post and certainly engaging in further dialogue around this notion of leadership.